Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Calvin was sitting in his office at the hospital when the phone vibrated for the third time in 5 minutes. It was Mitchell, the private detective he'd hired 3 days earlier. The message was blunt: "We need to talk. Urgent. Not over the phone." Calvin felt a tightness in his chest, the same feeling he got right before delivering bad news to a patient's family. He knew that tone meant trouble. They arranged to meet in an hour at a discreet cafe far from the hospital, far from anywhere someone might recognize him. Calvin was 61 years old and had dedicated his entire life to two things: saving hearts and protecting his family. Now, sitting in that cafe with the strong smell of espresso in the air and the soft afternoon light filtering through the windows, he was about to discover he'd failed at one of them. Mitchell arrived with a brown leather folder under his arm and an expression Calvin recognized well from decades in medicine. It was the look of someone who has to say something terrible but doesn't know where to begin. They exchanged quick greetings, and Mitchell got straight to the point. "Dr. Calvin, we've got a complicated situation here." "Very complicated." He opened the folder and started pulling out photographs, laying them carefully on the table as if they were pieces of evidence in a trial. And in a way, they were. "I followed Mrs. Melissa like you asked. Yesterday afternoon, she left her law office around 3 o'clock. I thought it was odd because it was so early, so I kept following." Calvin nodded, tense. "She drove to Myers Park and went into a luxury condo near Providence Road. I waited in my car, watching. 20 minutes later, someone else arrived and entered the same building." Mitchell paused and looked Calvin straight in the eyes. "Sir, it was your wife. Mrs. Diane." Calvin's world stopped for a second. He picked up the photos with hands that suddenly didn't feel like his own. There was Diane, wearing that blue dress he liked so much, walking into the building. The date and time were stamped in the corner of the image. Mitchell continued, his voice professional but tinged with discomfort. "I thought it might be a coincidence, maybe they had some appointment together, perhaps something family-related. But 3 hours later, they came out together, chatting animatedly, saying goodbye in the parking lot like old friends." Calvin was processing it, his medical mind trying to find a logical explanation, a diagnosis that made sense. "I decided to shift focus and follow Mrs. Diane. She drove for about 15 minutes to a house in Dilworth, in a quiet residential neighborhood. A man was waiting for her at the door. The next photos were devastating. Diane hugging a man Calvin didn't recognize. Diane walking into the house. The clock showing she stayed for 2 hours before leaving, fixing her hair, with that smile Calvin hadn't seen in years. Calvin felt sick to his stomach. Mitchell went on, explaining he'd looked into the man. His name was Greg Holloway, 52, a divorced businessman in financial consulting. I dug deeper over the last few hours, Doctor. This Greg has known Mrs. Diane for at least 8 months. They met at an investment seminar at the convention center back in March. And here's what really complicates everything." Mitchell pulled out more photos. "Mrs. Melissa is having an affair too, with a partner at her firm, a lawyer named Tyler Morrison. He's married, by the way. But here's the connection: Melissa introduced Greg to your mother-in-law at a charity event 6 months ago. They've been accomplices ever since." Calvin couldn't believe it. "Accomplices?" Mitchell nodded. "Melissa provides alibis for Diane. When Diane says she's at the spa with her daughter-in-law or organizing charity events, she's actually with Greg. And Diane does the same for Melissa. When Melissa says she's out shopping or visiting galleries with her mother-in-law, she's with Tyler. They've built a perfect system. A pact of lies." Calvin leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of 35 years of marriage crashing down on him. He'd hired that detective to protect his son, to find out if Melissa was cheating on Jason. And she was. But what he hadn't expected was to discover that his own wife, the woman he'd shared more than 3 decades of life with, was doing exactly the same thing. Worse, the two of them were working together, covering for each other, probably laughing at the naivety of the men who loved them. Calvin asked for all the evidence. Mitchell had everything organized: dated and timed photos, short discreetly filmed videos, even credit card receipts he'd obtained through investigative contacts. Diane had been using a secondary card Calvin rarely checked. All those charges for spas and dinners with friends now made terrible sense. Calvin paid the detective, thanked him for his professional work, and left that cafe a different man than the one who'd walked in. He was a surgeon, used to making quick, precise decisions in life-or-death situations. He wasn't going to waste time gathering more proof or suffering in silence. He knew exactly what to do. That evening, Calvin got home earlier than usual. Diane was in the kitchen preparing dinner, wearing a white apron and softly humming a tune he didn't recognize. The scene was so domestic, so normal, that Calvin felt a wave of pure anger rise in his chest. How could she do it? How could she do this every day, pretending everything was fine, that they were a happy couple, while sleeping with another man 3 times a week? Diane turned when she heard him come in and smiled. "Hey, honey. Didn't expect you so early. I'm making that salmon you like." Calvin set the folder on the kitchen counter, right next to the cutting board where Diane was chopping vegetables. "Diane, we need to talk. Now." The tone of his voice made her smile falter. "What's wrong? Did something happen at the hospital?" Calvin opened the folder and began pulling out the photos, laying them one by one on the granite countertop. The first showed Diane entering the building in Myers Park. The second showed her with Greg at the front door of the house in Dilworth. The third, more intimate, showed the two of them kissing. Calvin kept placing photos methodically, like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Diane's expression changed as if a mask had been ripped off. First came shock, wide eyes, mouth slightly open. Then panic, all the color draining from her face. And then, strangely, something resembling relief mixed with defiance. She dropped the knife and crossed her arms. "You had me investigated?" The indignation in her voice would have been comical if it weren't tragic. Calvin let out a humorless laugh. "Is that really your concern? Not the fact that you've been sleeping with another man for 8 months, but that I found out?" Diane flinched at the crude language. Calvin never talked like that. "I wasn't investigating you, Diane. I was investigating Melissa. I was worried about our son, thinking his wife might be cheating. And guess what? She is. But the surprise was finding out my own wife is her accomplice. That you two created some little club of lies." He tossed more photos onto the counter. Now they showed Melissa with Tyler. "You thought you were so clever, didn't you? You cover for her, she covers for you. 2 marriages destroyed, but at least you've got a friend to share your dirty secrets with." Diane tried to speak, but Calvin raised his hand. "No. You're going to listen to me first. 35 years, Diane. 35 damn years I spent building this life, this family. I worked double shifts, triple shifts at the hospital to give you comfort, security. You never had to work after Jason was born, never had to worry about money. And this is what I got in return? You sleeping with some second-rate consultant while I was saving lives?" Diane found her voice, and it came loaded with years of bottled-up resentment. "You're never here, Calvin. When was the last time we had dinner together without you getting called away for an emergency? When was the last time we really talked, when you looked at me like I even existed?" Calvin shook his head. "So the solution was to cheat? Was that it? You felt lonely, so you thought you had the right to destroy our marriage?" Diane stepped forward, her eyes glistening with tears and anger. "I didn't destroy anything that wasn't already dead. This marriage has been dead for years, Calvin. You just didn't notice because you're always too busy, always too important with your surgeries and your patients. Greg makes me feel alive again. He listens to me. He sees me. Calvin felt her words like knife wounds, but his voice came out cold and controlled. Greg makes you feel alive? Great. Wonderful. But answer me this, does Jason know his mother's a liar? That she turned his wife into a criminal partner? Diane paled again. You wouldn't, Calvin cut her off. I already did. I called Jason before coming home. He's on his way. He'll be here in about 20 minutes. I showed him the photos too, the ones of Melissa with that lawyer. He deserves to know his wife's cheating. And he deserves to know his own mother knew and helped hide it. Diane brought a hand to her mouth. My God, Calvin, you had no right, Calvin exploded. I had no right? Are you serious? You slept with another man for months, turned our daughter-in-law into your accomplice, lied to my face every single day, and I had no right to tell our son the truth? The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Diane started to cry, not the delicate tears she usually used to get her way, but deep, ugly sobs. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want to hurt Jason. I just wanted to feel desired again. Calvin pulled another envelope from the folder. While you were feeling desired, I was consulting Stuart Brennan. You know Stuart, don't you? Charlotte's most respected divorce attorney. He reviewed our case this morning. Diane looked up, frightened. We're in North Carolina, Diane. It's a no-fault divorce state, but adultery still affects alimony. And with this evidence? He tapped the folder. With dated photos, videos, receipts, witnesses, Stuart says you'll be lucky to get any alimony at all. As for asset division, well, you'll get what the law entitles you to, but don't think you're walking out of here with half of what I built. I've already started protecting our assets. All legal, all within the law. Diane sank into a chair, reality crashing down on her like an avalanche. You've already decided everything. You're not even going to try talking, therapy, anything? Calvin leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, his eyes locked on hers. Therapy? To fix what, exactly? You didn't trip and fall into bed with Greg, Diane. You chose. You chose every time you lied. Every time you covered for Melissa. Every time you looked me in the eye and pretended we were a happy couple. Those were conscious choices. And now you'll live with the consequences. The doorbell rang. Jason had arrived. Calvin went to answer it, leaving Diane shattered in the kitchen. When Jason walked in, his face was pale, his eyes red. It was clear he'd been crying on the drive over. Father and son embraced, a silent connection of shared pain. Diane appeared in the kitchen doorway, trying to pull herself together. Jason, honey, I can explain. Jason raised his hand, the same gesture his father had just used. He'd inherited more than Calvin's looks. No, Mom. Dad already showed me everything. The photos of you with that man. The photos of Melissa with her partner. And he told me about your little scheme. His voice trembled but stayed firm. You knew my wife was cheating on me and didn't tell me. Worse, you helped her hide it. You're my mother. How could you? Diane tried to move closer, but Jason stepped back. It wasn't like that, Jason. Melissa was going through a hard time, she confided in me, I couldn't just. Jason cut her off. Hard times? Do hard times justify cheating? And you, Mom? What were your problems that justified cheating on Dad for 8 months? He looked at Calvin, who remained silent, letting his son speak. Dad showed me everything. Told me he was investigating Melissa because he sensed something was wrong. He was trying to protect me. And you? You were making a fool out of me. Diane tried once more. Son, your father isn't perfect. He's never home, always puts work first, Calvin interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't try to shift blame onto me in front of our son, Diane. I worked hard my whole life to give this family everything it has. You want to blame me for being a dedicated provider? For saving lives? Go ahead. But don't change the subject. The issue here is betrayal. It's lies. It's complicity. Jason looked between his parents, watching the family he'd known his whole life disintegrate before his eyes. I need to go. I need to go home and confront Melissa. Calvin placed a hand on his son's shoulder. The evidence is in the folder. Everything you need. Stuart, my lawyer, can refer you to someone good for divorce. Someone who'll protect your interests. Jason nodded, picked up the folder, and walked out without looking back, without saying goodbye to his mother. When the door closed, Calvin turned to Diane one last time. You can stay tonight. Tomorrow morning, I want you out of this house. You can go to Greg's place, since he makes you feel so alive. You can go wherever you want. But not here. Diane was crying again. Calvin, please, can't we? Calvin shook his head. There's nothing to talk about. You made your choices. Now live with them. Oh, and one more thing. He picked up the phone. I called Margaret and Robert this afternoon. Margaret and Robert had been the couple's closest friends for 25 years. I told them everything. Showed them the proof. Margaret was especially shocked. I think she always admired you, always said our marriage was an example. Imagine her disappointment. Diane turned pale. You told our friends? Calvin smiled, but there was no humor in it. I did. And I'll tell others too. I won't lie for you, Diane. I won't pretend our marriage ended over irreconcilable differences or any crap like that. People will know the truth. You destroyed this family, and everyone will know exactly how. Diane started screaming, calling him cruel, vengeful. Calvin simply walked upstairs, went to the guest room, locked the door, and left her shouting in the living room. In the weeks that followed, hell unfolded on multiple fronts. Jason confronted Melissa that very night. The photos were undeniable. Melissa first tried to deny it, then downplay it, then blame work stress and a passionless marriage. Jason, who'd learned from his father about dignity and boundaries, simply served her divorce papers a week later. Melissa tried to reconcile, cried, begged, but Jason was unmoved. Betrayal was one thing. Complicity with his mother, turning the whole family into a farce, was unforgivable. Tyler Morrison, Melissa's lover, had his own troubles. When the partners at the law firm found out about the affair through rumors that quickly spread through Charlotte's legal community, he was discreetly but firmly pressured to leave the firm. Extramarital relationships with colleagues were bad for the firm's image, especially a conservative one that handled family law cases. Tyler left the firm within 3 months, and his own marriage collapsed when his wife found out everything. Greg Holloway, the businessman who made Diane feel alive, reacted exactly as Calvin had predicted. Once he realized the scale of the scandal, how it was spreading through Charlotte's business circles, how his name was being tied to the destruction of a respected family, Greg simply vanished. He stopped answering Diane's calls, blocked her, even changed his number. Men like Greg loved married women precisely because they were safe, commitment-free, low maintenance. But a divorced woman, socially ruined, needy, and requiring support? That wasn't part of the plan. Diane found herself not only divorced but abandoned by the man she'd risked everything for. The asset division took 8 months of tense negotiation. North Carolina follows equitable distribution, not necessarily equal. Calvin's lawyer Stuart strategically used the evidence of adultery. Although state law doesn't let infidelity directly affect asset division, he argued that Diane had used marital funds to sustain the affair, including the joint credit card for hotels, gifts, and dinners with Greg. In the end, Calvin kept the family home, most of the substantial savings accumulated over decades of well-paid medical work, and his investments. Diane received a smaller share, enough to live comfortably, but far from the lifestyle she'd enjoyed. As for alimony, the judge granted a modest temporary amount for only 3 years, considering the marriage's length but also Diane's conduct and the fact that at 56, she was capable of working. A year and a half later, life had reshaped itself in ways no one could have predicted on that fateful night. Calvin remained a respected surgeon. If anything, the scandal had earned him sympathy in medical and social circles. He was seen as the wronged party, the devoted man who'd been betrayed while saving lives. He'd started dating casually, nothing serious, but was learning to live for himself for the first time in decades. He discovered he enjoyed traveling, something he'd never had time for while building his career and raising a family. He went to Italy, to Japan, places Diane had always wanted to visit but never did. There was irony in that, and Calvin didn't mind. Jason was living in a new downtown Charlotte apartment. His divorce from Melissa had been finalized in 6 months. Melissa had tried repeatedly to reconcile, showing up at his apartment, sending long 3 a.m. messages about how she'd made a terrible mistake, how much she loved him. Jason eventually blocked her. There was no anger left, just an emptiness where love used to be. He was in therapy, working through the betrayal and broken trust, not just with Melissa, but also with his mother. Jason and Diane's relationship was severely damaged. They spoke occasionally, short, formal conversations. Jason couldn't forgive her complicity, the fact that she'd known and chosen to hide it. That, somehow, hurt more than Melissa's betrayal itself. It was a layered betrayal, familial and deep. Calvin and Jason, on the other hand, had grown closer than ever. Shared suffering had united them in a way years of family dinners never had. They played golf regularly, had dinner together, talked about life, trust, rebuilding. Calvin taught his son what decades of medicine had taught him, that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. That healing takes time, but it happens if you allow it. Diane was living in a modest apartment in a less affluent Charlotte neighborhood. The Pilates studio she'd run as a hobby shut down shortly after the divorce. Without Calvin's financial support and with her reputation tarnished among clients, it simply wasn't viable. She'd found work giving private piano lessons again, returning to the profession she'd abandoned 30 years earlier. It was humiliating, in a way, starting over after all that time. But maybe it was what she needed. Loneliness weighed heavily on her. Margaret, Robert, and the couple's other friends had taken sides, and most had stood with Calvin. Not out of malice, but because the truth was clear, Diane had cheated, lied, and manipulated. It was hard to sympathize with that. Greg never came back. Diane tried contacting him a few times in the first months, but eventually understood she'd been used, that she'd never been special to him, just convenient. Melissa also disappeared from Diane's life after the divorce. The complicity that had bound them dissolved into the bitterness of 2 women who'd lost everything. On an autumn afternoon, nearly 2 years after that devastating night, Calvin was in the garden of the house, the same house where he'd lived with Diane for decades, now his alone. Jason was visiting, and they were grilling, drinking beer, talking about future plans. Jason mentioned he'd started seeing someone, an architect he'd met through friends. It was light, no pressure, but he was enjoying it. Calvin smiled, genuinely happy for his son. "Do you think you'll be able to trust again?" Jason asked suddenly, his half-empty beer in hand. "I mean, someone. After everything." Calvin considered the question. "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe not. But I've learned something important." He looked at his son. Trusting someone isn't about guarantees. It never was. It's about choosing to believe, knowing you might get hurt. Diane hurt me. Hurt you. But that doesn't mean every woman will do the same. Melissa betrayed you, but that doesn't mean every woman will betray. Jason nodded thoughtfully. Do you regret investigating? Finding out? Calvin shook his head immediately. Not for a second. The truth sets you free, Jason. It's a cliché, but it's true. I could have been living a lie all this time, thinking I had a happy marriage while Diane laughed at me behind my back. Now, at least, I'm free. Free to rebuild. Free to be honest with myself. They clinked glasses in silence, father and son, survivors of a storm that nearly destroyed them but in the end only made them stronger. Calvin's story spread, not as malicious gossip, but as a cautionary tale. In medical circles, in social groups, it became the example of the man who tried to protect his son and ended up saving himself. It was the story of the detective hired to investigate the daughter-in-law who exposed the wife. It was the lesson about female complicity and betrayal, about how lies intertwine and families unravel. But it was also a story about dignity in pain, about facing the truth head-on, about not collecting evidence when one piece is enough, about acting quickly and decisively when trust is broken. Calvin learned, in the most painful way possible, that danger doesn't always come from where you expect. He'd been protecting his son, caring for his family, being the vigilant patriarch. But while he looked outward, the enemy was inside his home, sharing his bed, his dinners, his life. And Diane? She learned that choices have consequences. That comfort comes at a price. That men like Greg don't save anyone, they just use. That accomplice friends aren't true friends. And that when you destroy an entire family for a moment of passion, you destroy yourself most of all. Charlotte kept turning, the seasons changed, life went on. But for some people, that day when the photos were laid on the granite countertop split their lives into before and after. Before the truth, and after it. And there was no going back. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.